Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where deadly warriors came home to wives who could kill you with kindness. Literally. Picture this. You're kneeling in a dimly lit room, watching a woman in silk kimono perform movements so precise they'd make a surgeon jealous, while her husband's bloodstained katana rests just meters away in the next room. She pours tea with the same focus he uses to decapitate enemies. And honestly, you probably won't survive the emotional whiplash of learning how these incredible women balanced brutality and beauty in medieval Japan. Through Par Minutes, you'll discover how samurai wives didn't just serve tea, they weaponized tranquility, turning simple ceremonies into acts of psychological warfare that could topple governments and save lives. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing where this journey takes us around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through the wooden corridors of a 12th century Buddhist temple in Kyoto, your feet silent on tatami mats that have absorbed centuries of whispered prayers. The air smells of incense and something else, something earthy and bitter that makes your mouth water. You follow the scent deeper into the temple complex, past monks in saffron robes who nod respectfully as you pass. They know why you're here, even if you don't quite understand it yet. In a small chamber tucked away from the main halls, you discover her, Lady Takiko, wife of a samurai lord whose name strikes fear into enemy clans across the region. But here now, she's not the fierce political strategist who whispers battle plans into her husband's ear. She's kneeling before a simple iron kettle, her movements flowing like water as she prepares tea with a reverence that would shame most priests. This is where it all began. This unlikely marriage between Zen Buddhism and the warrior class that would define Japanese culture for centuries. You watch as Lady Takiko lifts the tea whisk, her wrist rotating in perfect circles that create foam patterns as intricate as the cherry blossoms painted on her kimono. She learned this from Master Isa himself, the monk who brought both tea and Zen Buddhism from China to Japan in 1191. The irony isn't lost on you as you observe this scene. Here's a woman whose husband makes his living through violence, finding peace in rituals that demand absolute stillness of mind. But that's exactly why it works. In a world where death lurks around every political corner, where alliances shift like morning mist, and where your husband might not return from his next campaign, the tea ceremony offers something precious. Control. You notice how her breathing synchronizes with each movement. Inhale as she scoops the emerald tea powder, exhale as she pours the water. This isn't just about making a beverage. It's active meditation, a way to center herself before facing the chaos that defines samurai life. The Buddhist influence is unmistakable in every gesture, from the way she bows to the tea implements as if they were sacred objects, to the mindful attention she pays to each sensory detail. Historians still argue whether these early tea ceremonies were purely spiritual practices or already carried political undertones. But you can see both elements at work. Lady Takiko serves the tea to a visiting monk, but also to another samurai wife whose husband's loyalty has been questioned lately. The ceremony becomes a neutral ground where dangerous conversations can happen under the guise of spiritual practice. The mainstream historical fact that most people know is that tea ceremony developed from Chinese traditions brought by Buddhist monks. But here's something that might surprise you. The earliest Japanese tea ceremonies were actually quite crude affairs, nothing like the refined rituals we associate with the practice today. Those early samurai wives were essentially winging it, adapting Chinese customs to fit their own cultural needs and domestic realities. As you watch Lady Takiko serve tea, you realize she's performing multiple roles simultaneously. She's a spiritual practitioner seeking enlightenment through mindful action. She's a political operative gathering intelligence through intimate conversation. She's a cultural innovator adapting foreign customs to Japanese sensibilities. And perhaps most importantly, she's a woman carving out space for female authority in a male-dominated world. The tea room becomes her domain, the one place where she sets the rules and controls the rhythm of interaction. When powerful men enter this space, they must follow her lead, submit to her timing, accept her hospitality on her terms. It's a subtle but revolutionary shift in power dynamics that you can practically feel in the air. You smell the bitter sweetness of matcha mixing with sandalwood incense. Hear the soft whisper of silk against tatami. See the way shadows dance across painted screens as oil lamps flicker. Every sense is engaged, every moment deliberately crafted to create an experience that transcends ordinary consciousness. This is meditation in motion, prayer through gesture, worship expressed in hospitality. But even in this sacred space, reminders of the warrior world intrude. Through paper screens, you hear the distant sound of sword practice in the courtyard. A messenger arrives with news from the capital that makes Lady Takiko's hand pause for just a moment as she reaches for the tea caddy. These women lived with one foot in the spiritual realm and one foot in a world where political mistakes meant death for entire families. As the ceremony concludes and the guests bow their thanks, you see Lady Takiko's transformation. The serene tea master persona falls away, replaced by the sharp-eyed strategist who will spend the next hour analyzing every word spoken, every gesture made, every implication hidden beneath polite conversation. She learned something valuable in that room, information that might save her husband's life or advance her family's position, and she gathered it through the simple act of serving tea. This is how it began, this art form that would become synonymous with Japanese culture. Not in palaces or formal courts, but in Buddhist temples where samurai wives sought moments of peace in lives defined by conflict. They took a foreign practice and made it their own, infusing it with Japanese aesthetics and feminine wisdom that would influence the culture for centuries. The morning mist clings to the pine trees surrounding the Minamoto compound as you witness one of the most politically charged tea ceremonies in Japanese history. You're invisible in the corner of an elegantly appointed room, watching as 18-year-old Lady Masako prepares to meet her future husband through the ancient ritual of matrimonial tea service. But this isn't just any arranged marriage. This union will either stabilize the Kamakura shogunate or plunge the country into civil war. You can practically taste the tension in the air as Lady Masako's hands move through the familiar motions she's practiced since childhood. Her father, a powerful daimyo, arranged this marriage to strengthen political alliances, but everyone in the room knows the real stakes. If she can win over Lord Yashitsune through tea ceremony, two rival clans might find peace. If she fails, well, you've seen what happens when samurai negotiations go badly, and it usually involves considerably more blood than tea. The social expectations weighing on Lady Masako's shoulders would crush most people. She must demonstrate cultural refinement that proves her worthy of high-ranking marriage, while also showing the strength and intelligence necessary to manage a warrior household. The tea ceremony becomes her job interview, personality test, and political audition all rolled into one. No pressure, right? You watch as she arranges the tea implements with mathematical precision. Each placement carries meaning. The tea caddy positioned to show respect for her guest's higher rank. the water jar angled to suggest openness to alliance. Even the choice of tea bowl sends a message about her family's aesthetic preferences and cultural sophistication. It's like watching someone play chess with porcelain and bamboo. What strikes you most is how these young women navigated the impossible contradiction at the heart of their existence. They were expected to embody perfect feminine submission, while simultaneously wielding enough intelligence and strength to advise warrior husbands on life and death decisions. The tea ceremony gave them a venue to demonstrate both qualities simultaneously, showing grace and obedience through ritual service, while proving their strategic thinking through subtle manipulation of ceremony elements. The mainstream historical fact here is that arranged marriages were the norm for samurai families, used primarily to cement political alliances and consolidate power. But here's what most people don't realize. Samurai wives often had significant input into these arrangements, especially regarding secondary marriages and adoptions that could affect family succession. They weren't just passive pawns in political games. They were active players who used ceremonies like this to assess potential allies and enemies. As Lord Yashitsune enters the tea room, you notice how Lady Masako's breathing changes, not from nervousness, but from the shift into performance mode that every accomplished tea practitioner learns. She's no longer just a young woman meeting her future husband. She's become a living embodiment of her family's values, education, and cultural refinement. The ceremony transforms her into something larger than herself. You observe the intricate dance of courtship unfolding through tea service. When Lady Masako offers the first bowl, she kneels in a position that demonstrates perfect training while allowing her to observe Lord Yashitsune's reaction. Does he appreciate the seasonal flower arrangement she chose? Can he identify the specific type of bamboo used in the tea whisk? His responses tell her everything she needs to know about his cultural education and aesthetic sensibilities. But this isn't just one-way evaluation. Lord Yashitsune is also using the ceremony to assess his potential bride. You can see him noting how she handles unexpected moments, when a servant accidentally disturbs the hanging scroll, when incense smoke wavers due to a draft, when distant sounds of sword practice intrude on the ceremony's serenity. These disruptions reveal character in ways that formal conversation never could. Historians still argue whether love ever factored into these arranged marriages, but you can see something genuine developing between Lady Masako and Lord Yashitsune as the ceremony progresses. Not romance exactly, but mutual respect born from recognizing each other's competence and cultural sophistication. The tea ceremony creates intimacy through shared aesthetic experience, even between strangers meeting for the first time. The conversation flows as smoothly as the tea itself, touching on safe topics like seasonal poetry and garden design, while both participants probe for deeper insights. Lady Masako mentions her admiration for a particular Buddhist text, revealing her educational background and spiritual inclinations. Lord Yashitsune responds by describing his own temple visits, suggesting shared values that might form the foundation for successful marriage. You realize you're witnessing the development of what would become a distinctly Japanese approach to arranged marriage, one that balanced family political needs with individual compatibility. The tea ceremony provided a structured environment where both parties could evaluate each other as complete human beings, not just political assets. It was probably the closest thing to dating that existed in medieval Japan. As the ceremony reaches its climax, Lady Masako performs the most challenging aspect of tea service, the final presentation that requires perfect coordination of multiple elements. You watch her synchronize the whisking of tea, the positioning of the bowl, the timing of her bow, and the modulation of her voice as she offers the tea with traditional phrases. One mistake could embarrass both families and jeopardize the marriage negotiations. But she's flawless, of course. Years of training under her mother and aunt have prepared her for exactly this moment. The tea foam forms perfect peaks. The bowl turns smoothly in her hands. Her voice carries just the right combination of humility and confidence. Lord Yashitsune accepts the tea with equal grace, and you can practically hear both families exhaling in relief. The political implications extend far beyond this single marriage. You're watching the formation of alliance networks that will shape Japanese politics for generations. Lady Masako's success in this ceremony means her children will inherit claims to both family lineages. Her sisters will be considered desirable marriage partners for other high-ranking samurai, and her parents will have secured their clan's position in the complex hierarchy of warrior society. But perhaps most importantly, you're witnessing how samurai wives used tea ceremony to claim agency within arranged marriage systems. While they couldn't choose their husbands, they could influence how those relationships developed. A skillful tea ceremony could transform a purely political arrangement into a partnership based on mutual respect and shared aesthetic values. As the formal ceremony concludes and both families begin discussing practical marriage arrangements, you see Lady Masako and Lord Yashitsune exchange one final glance of understanding. They're both products of their time and social class, but they're also individuals who found a way to connect across the constraints of arranged marriage. The tea ceremony gave them that bridge, a shared language of beauty and mindfulness that transcended political calculation. You step across the threshold of the tea house and immediately understand why samurai wives considered this space sacred. The dimensions feel impossibly intimate, barely 4.5 tatami mats creating a room so small that you could touch opposite walls with outstretched arms. Yet somehow, this tiny space contains more concentrated beauty and meaning than entire palaces you've wandered through in your dreams. The ceiling hovers just high enough to allow kneeling, forcing everyone who enters to adopt positions of humility regardless of their rank in the outside world. Your eyes adjust to the soft, filtered light entering through paper screens that transform harsh sunlight into something that caresses rather than blazes. Lady Masako, now the most powerful woman in Japan as the shogun's widow, kneels in the corner that serves as the host position. But here, in this space she designed according to principles that balance masculine and feminine energy. Her political power matters less than her ability to create harmony through careful attention to aesthetic detail. You notice how every element of the tea room architecture reflects the unique challenge these women faced, creating spaces where warrior husbands could experience peace without feeling emasculated. The alcove displays a hanging scroll featuring bold calligraphy that references military virtues, but the flowers arranged beneath it speak of seasonal beauty and life's transient nature. It's visual diplomacy, using spatial design to bridge the gap between battlefield and garden. The wooden beams above your head were cut from trees that witnessed centuries of history, their grain patterns creating subtle visual rhythms that encourage meditation. Lady Masako chose this particular wood not just for its beauty, but because it came from her husband's ancestral lands, connecting the tea house to family heritage and military tradition. Every architectural choice carries multiple layers of meaning that visitors decode unconsciously as they settle into the ceremony space. You breathe in the complex aromatics that define this environment. Tatami mats releasing their grassy sweetness, wooden walls aged to honey-colored perfection, and the lingering traces of countless tea ceremonies that have saturated every surface with subtle fragrances. This isn't just a room. It's an instrument designed to transform consciousness through sensory immersion. The entrance requires visitors to crawl through an opening barely 2 feet high, called the Nijiriguchi. You watch as a powerful daimyo, who commands thousands of soldiers, awkwardly maneuvers through this tiny portal. His sword's left outside according to tea house protocol. The architecture literally forces visitors to abandon their external status and enter as equals. Lady Masako designed it this way intentionally. Even the most arrogant samurai must humble himself to experience her hospitality. But here's something most people don't realize about these tea houses. They were often the most defensible rooms in the entire compound. The single entrance, thick walls, and strategic positioning within the garden made them natural panic rooms where families could retreat during attacks. Samurai wives weren't just creating spaces for aesthetic contemplation. They were designing elegant fortresses that could protect lives while maintaining the appearance of peaceful domesticity. You notice how the proportions create an almost womb-like sense of security and intimacy. The golden ratio appears everywhere, in the relationship between ceiling height and floor space, in the positioning of structural elements, in the placement of the alcove relative to the guest seating area. These mathematical harmonies work on your nervous system below conscious awareness, inducing the calm focus necessary for meaningful tea ceremony. The lighting design demonstrates sophisticated understanding of psychology and mood manipulation. Windows position themselves to capture morning light for certain types of ceremonies, afternoon light for others. Lady Masako can control the emotional tone of any gathering simply by scheduling it for optimal lighting conditions. Want to create introspective contemplation? Use the soft, indirect light of late afternoon. Need to energize political discussions? Schedule ceremonies to capture the crisp clarity of morning sun. Historians still argue whether tea house architecture influenced broader Japanese design aesthetics or simply reflected existing cultural preferences. But you can see innovation happening in real time as Lady Masako makes subtle adjustments to the space. She's experimenting with different arrangements of the few furnishings, testing how various configurations affect the flow of conversation and the rhythm of tea service. The seasonal adaptability of the space amazes you as you watch servants make subtle changes that transform the room's character. Summer configurations emphasize cooling elements, bamboo screens that filter light differently, arrangements that suggest water and shade, even the choice of tatami mats woven with grass varieties that release cooling fragrances when walked upon. Winter setups create psychological warmth through deeper colors, heavier textures, and arrangements that suggest coziness and protection from harsh weather. You realize you're witnessing the birth of concepts that will influence architecture globally. The idea that interior space should respond to natural rhythms, that rooms should be designed around specific activities rather than general purposes, that beauty and function can integrate seamlessly when guided by philosophical principles rather than just practical needs. The tea room becomes a stage where Lady Masako can orchestrate complex social interactions with theatrical precision. She controls not just what happens, but how it feels to happen. The intimate scale means every gesture gains significance, every word carries weight, every pause creates drama. Political negotiations that might drag on for hours in formal meeting rooms can be resolved quickly in the heightened awareness that the tea house environment creates. But the space also serves as Lady Masako's private retreat, where she can escape the constant demands of managing a warrior household. You watch her perform solo tea ceremonies, using the familiar rituals to center herself before facing difficult decisions about family alliances, financial investments, or political strategies. The tea room gives her something every samurai wife desperately needed, a space that belonged entirely to her, where she could think clearly without interruption. The acoustic properties deserve special attention as you listen to how sounds behave in this carefully designed environment. Conversations remain private despite thin walls, thanks to strategic placement of sound-absorbing materials and the masking effect of water features in the adjacent garden. Lady Masako can conduct sensitive political discussions without fear of eavesdropping, making the tea house the most secure communication space in the entire compound. As evening approaches and shadows lengthen across the tatami, you see how the space transforms yet again. Oil lamps create pools of warm light that make faces seem to glow, while darker corners provide psychological refuge for visitors who prefer to remain partially hidden during difficult conversations. The tea room adapts to human needs with almost magical responsiveness. The genius of Lady Masako's design becomes clear as you observe its long-term effects on everyone. You kneel beside Lady Hojo Takiko as she prepares to embody the most challenging paradox of samurai wife existence, creating perfect harmony while surrounded by the constant threat of violence. Her husband has just returned from a campaign where he personally beheaded 3 rival clan leaders, their severed heads now displayed on pikes outside the compound gates. Yet here, in the tea room, she must generate an atmosphere of such profound peace that visiting dignitaries will forget their sitting meters away from fresh evidence of brutal warfare. You watch her breathe deeply, activating the first principle of tea ceremony, wa, or harmony. But this isn't the superficial harmony of polite conversation or social pleasantries. This is something much deeper, the ability to recognize and balance opposing forces without being destroyed by their conflict. Lady Takiko must harmonize her own nature with her husband's, the needs of their guests with the requirements of political strategy, the aesthetic ideals of tea ceremony with the harsh realities of survival in medieval Japan. The mainstream historical fact about tea ceremony principles is that they were codified by the great tea master Sen no Rikyu in the 16th century. But here's what most people don't realize. These principles were already being lived and refined by samurai wives centuries earlier. They didn't need formal philosophical frameworks. They were too busy applying these concepts in life-and-death situations where failure meant disaster for entire families. As Lady Takiko begins the ceremony, you see her embody respect, in ways that would make professional diplomats weep with envy. She's serving tea to 2 men who were trying to kill each other last month, and her task is to create enough mutual respect between them that they'll agree to a temporary ceasefire. Every bow, every gesture, every word choice must demonstrate perfect respect while subtly guiding these warriors toward reconciliation. You notice how she uses physical positioning to reinforce respect relationships. The most honored guest receives the tea bowl with its most beautiful design facing toward him. The second guest gets the bowl turned to display a different but equally attractive aspect. Neither man can claim preferential treatment, yet both feel appropriately honored. It's diplomatic genius disguised as simple politeness. The third principle, sei or purity, becomes almost comically challenging to maintain when your guests arrive covered in battlefield dust, and your servants are still washing blood off armor in the courtyard. But Lady Takiko has mastered the art of creating psychological purity even amid physical chaos. The tea implements shine with perfect cleanliness. The room air has been purified with carefully chosen incense, and every surface gleams with meticulous attention to detail. You realize that purity in this context means something more profound than mere cleanliness. It's about creating space free from ulterior motives, hidden agendas, and deceptive appearances. Lady Takiko must generate an environment where even habitual liars feel compelled toward honesty, where warriors accustomed to constant suspicion can experience moments of genuine trust. The physical purity of the tea ceremony becomes a catalyst for psychological and spiritual purification. Historians still argue whether these tea ceremony principles were originally Buddhist concepts adapted for secular use, or indigenous Japanese values that found expression through Buddhist-influenced rituals. But you can see both traditions merging in Lady Takiko's practice. She's creating something new, a distinctly Japanese approach to conflict resolution that uses aesthetic experience to transform human consciousness. The fourth principle, Jaku or tranquility, presents the ultimate challenge. How do you generate genuine tranquility when everyone in the room knows that political alliances can shift overnight? That today's ally might be tomorrow's executioner? That the wrong word or gesture could trigger violence that destroys entire bloodlines? Lady Takiko must create tranquility not by eliminating these threats, but by transcending them through focused attention on present moment experience. You watch her demonstrate that true tranquility isn't the absence of danger, but the ability to remain centered despite danger's presence. Her movements flow with perfect calm even as messengers arrive with news of approaching enemy armies. She maintains serene focus on tea preparation, even when conversations touch on strategies for defending the compound against siege. This isn't denial or avoidance. It's the sophisticated mental discipline that allows her to function effectively in impossible circumstances. The tea whisk becomes an instrument of meditation as Lady Takiko creates foam patterns that seem to hypnotize her guests into states of focused attention. You realize she's using the rhythmic, repetitive motions to induce mild trance states that make productive conversation possible between men who normally communicate through sword fighting. The ceremony doesn't just serve tea. It alters consciousness in ways that enable peaceful problem solving. But here's something that might surprise you. Lady Takiko is also using these principles as psychological weapons. Her perfect demonstration of harmony makes her guests ashamed of their own crude behavior. Her respectful treatment forces them to reciprocate with respect they don't normally show. Her commitment to purity makes their impure motives seem obviously inadequate. Her tranquility contrasts so dramatically with their agitation that they feel compelled to calm themselves to match her energy level. You notice how the four principles work together synergistically, each one reinforcing and amplifying the others. Harmony becomes easier to achieve when respect is present. Respect deepens when purity creates trustworthy environments. Purity becomes more than superficial when tranquility allows deep cleaning of consciousness. Tranquility becomes sustainable when harmony, respect, and purity provide supportive foundations. The ceremony progresses, and you see Lady Takiko adapt the principles to handle increasingly complex situations. When one guest becomes argumentative, she uses exaggerated respect to de-escalate without appearing to criticize his behavior. When political discussions threaten to become heated, she redirects attention to aesthetic details that restore harmony. When external noises intrude on tranquility, she incorporates them into the ceremony experience rather than fighting against their presence. As the formal tea service concludes, both warrior guests have visibly transformed. Their postures have relaxed, their voices have softened, their facial expressions show openness rather than suspicion. Lady Takiko has literally used the four principles to reprogram their nervous systems, creating psychological states where cooperation becomes possible. They'll leave this tea room with preliminary agreements that might prevent months of bloodshed. You realize you've witnessed something extraordinary, the practical application of profound philosophical principles in extreme circumstances. These weren't abstract concepts for Lady Takiko. They were survival tools as essential as her husband's swords and armor. The four principles of tea ceremony gave samurai wives frameworks for managing the impossible contradictions of their existence, allowing them to create islands of civilization in seas of barbarism. The oil lamps flicker as evening deepens, casting dancing shadows that seem to celebrate the successful resolution of potentially deadly conflicts. Lady Takiko begins the careful cleaning of tea implements, her movements still embodying all four principles even in this mundane task. She's demonstrated that harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility aren't just ideals to aspire toward. They're practical skills that can be mastered and applied in any situation. The cherry blossoms outside Lady Minamoto Yoshitsune's tea house are performing their annual miracle of perfect timing, blooming just as her husband returns from the spring military campaign. You watch her prepare for the most challenging tea ceremony of her year, the seasonal welcome that must help a battle-hardened warrior transition from months of violence back to domestic life. She has exactly one afternoon to transform a man who's been sleeping on hard ground and killing enemies into someone capable of appreciating the subtle beauty of tea foam patterns. You notice how she's timed everything according to natural rhythms that most people ignore. The ceremony begins precisely when afternoon light filters through the newly opened cherry blossoms, creating pink-tinted shadows that dance across the tatami mats. This wasn't luck or coincidence. Lady Yoshitsune has been tracking seasonal changes for months, calculating exactly when the blossoms would reach peak beauty and scheduling her husband's homecoming ceremony accordingly. The tea implements she's chosen reflect deep understanding of seasonal psychology. The water jar features a design of flowing streams that suggests spring freshness and renewal. The tea caddy displays young bamboo shoots reaching towards sunlight, symbolizing growth and new beginnings. Even the incense carries cherry blossom fragrance mixed with sandalwood, creating olfactory associations with both beauty and strength. She's orchestrating a complete sensory experience designed to reprogram her husband's consciousness from warfare to peace. You observe the complex logistics required to maintain seasonal tea ceremony practices in a warrior household. While Lady Yoshitsune was preparing delicate spring arrangements, her staff was cleaning blood off armor and sharpening weapons for the next campaign. She had to coordinate aesthetic perfection with military practicalities, ensuring that her pursuit of beauty didn't interfere with her husband's preparations for violence. The mainstream historical fact here is that Japanese culture has always emphasized seasonal awareness, with formal ceremonies marking important transitions throughout the year. But here's what most people don't realize. Samurai wives were often the primary guardians of these seasonal traditions, maintaining cultural continuity even when their husbands spent months away from home, engaged in constant warfare. As Lord Yoshitsune enters the tea room, you can see the jarring contrast between his military persona and the delicate environment his wife has created. His movements are sharp and economical, conditioned by months of combat readiness. His eyes automatically scan for potential threats and escape routes. His posture remains alert for sudden attacks. Lady Yoshitsune must somehow guide this hypervigilant warrior into the receptive mindset necessary for appreciating seasonal beauty. You watch her deploy sophisticated understanding of trauma psychology centuries before such concepts were formally recognized. She doesn't try to force immediate transformation, instead allowing her husband to maintain his defensive posture while gradually introducing elements that activate different neural pathways. The rhythmic sound of the tea whisk creates patterns similar to meditation techniques. The warm tea provides physical comfort that helps nervous systems downshift from high alert to relaxed awareness. The timing of seasonal ceremonies serves strategic purposes beyond aesthetic appreciation. Lady Yashitsune is using the spring tea ceremony to brief her husband on political developments that occurred during his absence, family decisions that require his input, and social obligations that need attention before the next military campaign. The ceremony becomes a vehicle for information transfer disguised as cultural celebration. You notice how she adapts the ceremony to accommodate her husband's shortened attention span and heightened startle response. Movements that might normally unfold slowly get compressed into slightly faster rhythms. Conversations that could meander through philosophical topics stay focused on concrete, practical matters. She's providing psychological rehabilitation through aesthetic experience, helping her husband transition between radically different modes of existence. The seasonal flower arrangement deserves special attention as you observe its psychological effects. Lady Yashitsune has chosen branches that show both cherry blossoms and new leaves, symbolizing the balance between beauty and growth, fragility and strength. The arrangement occupies the visual focal point of the tea room, drawing her husband's combat-trained attention toward life and renewal rather than death and destruction. Historians still argue whether seasonal ceremonies were primarily aesthetic celebrations or practical psychological interventions, but you can see both functions operating simultaneously. The beauty serves healing purposes, while the healing makes appreciation of beauty possible. Lady Yashitsune has created a feedback loop where aesthetic experience and psychological recovery reinforce each other. As the ceremony progresses, you witness the gradual transformation of Lord Yashitsune's body language and facial expressions. His shoulders drop from their defensive elevation. His jaw releases tension accumulated during months of gritting teeth against pain and fear. His eyes soften from the thousand-yard stare of battlefield survivors to something approaching wonder as he notices subtle details in the tea bowl's glaze patterns. The conversation flows naturally from immediate practical concerns toward broader reflection on the season's meaning and beauty. Lady Yashitsune guides the discussion with questions that help her husband process recent experiences, while reconnecting with aspects of himself that warfare had temporarily suppressed. She's conducting psychotherapy through poetry, using shared appreciation of seasonal imagery to rebuild emotional intimacy. You realize you're witnessing the development of what would become a distinctly Japanese approach to healing trauma through aesthetic experience. Rather than directly confronting psychological wounds, Lady Yashitsune is surrounding them with beauty until they transform naturally. The seasonal ceremony provides structure for this healing process, ensuring that recovery happens on schedule rather than being left to chance. The timing also serves family political purposes that extend beyond individual psychology. By scheduling the spring ceremony to coincide with her husband's return, Lady Yashitsune ensures that other clan members and political allies witness his successful transition from warrior to cultured aesthete. This demonstrates family stability and sophistication that strengthens their position in complex social hierarchies. As evening approaches and the cherry blossom shadows lengthen across the tea room, you see the ceremony's deeper purpose fulfilled. Lord Yashitsune has reconnected not just with seasonal beauty, but with the parts of himself that value beauty over destruction, creation over conquest, life over death. The seasonal timing wasn't just aesthetic preference. It was psychological necessity, providing natural rhythms that help human consciousness navigate the extreme transitions required by samurai life. The tea ceremony concludes with both husband and wife appreciating the ephemeral nature of cherry blossoms. Their brief moment of perfect, you kneel beside Lady Ashikaga Takako as she contemplates the single camellia blossom that will define today's tea ceremony. Its blood-red petals almost mockingly beautiful against the snow-covered garden outside. This isn't just any flower arrangement. It's psychological warfare disguised as aesthetic expression. The camellia blooms in winter when everything else dies, making it the perfect metaphor for the resilience she needs to demonstrate to visiting allies who are questioning her family's ability to survive political upheaval. The art of ikebana, as you're witnessing it being born, represents something far more complex than pretty flower arrangements. Lady Takako is using botanical elements to communicate messages that could never be spoken aloud in her politically dangerous household. That single camellia, positioned at precisely the right angle to catch morning light, tells everyone who enters the tea room that the Ashikaga clan remains strong despite recent military defeats. It's a declaration of war made with petals and branches. You watch her hands move with surgeon-like precision as she adjusts the placement of bare winter branches that will support the camellia's dramatic statement. Each branch has been chosen not just for its visual contribution, but for its symbolic meaning. The angular lines suggest strength under pressure, while the apparent randomness of their positioning creates natural asymmetry that represents the balance between control and surrender necessary for survival in uncertain times. The mainstream historical fact about ikebana is that it developed from Buddhist altar offerings and gradually became a secular art form. But here's what most people don't realize. Samurai wives were using flower arrangements for coded communication centuries before ikebana became formally recognized as an art form. These women turned botanical beauty into a sophisticated information system that allowed them to share intelligence, coordinate political strategies, and even plan military operations. Lady Takako's choice of container reveals layers of meaning that you're only beginning to understand. The bronze vase was crafted by her husband's grandfather, connecting the arrangement to family heritage and military tradition. Its patina shows age and endurance, suggesting that current difficulties are temporary challenges that will be overcome through persistence and wisdom. The vase's proportions follow mathematical ratios that create psychological effects on viewers, inducing states of calm confidence that make her political messages more persuasive. You notice how she's using negative space as skillfully as she employs the visible elements. The empty areas around the camellia create breathing room that prevents the arrangement from feeling crowded or desperate. This demonstrates mastery of restraint, showing visitors that the Ashikaga family maintains composure even under extreme pressure. The arrangement suggests abundance through careful use of scarcity, proving that true wealth lies in knowing what to include and what to leave out. The timing of this particular arrangement carries urgent political significance. Lady Takako is expecting a visit from representatives of the Hasakawa clan, whose support could determine whether her family survives the current succession crisis. The winter camellia arrangement will be the first thing these visitors see when they enter the tea room, and their reaction will reveal their true intentions. If they appreciate the artistic statement, they're likely to be sympathetic allies. If they dismiss it as mere decoration, she'll know they're potential enemies. But the arrangement also serves personal psychological purposes that extend beyond political messaging. You watch Lady Takako's breathing synchronize with her careful adjustments to branch positions, her nervous system calming as she focuses on aesthetic perfection. The process of creating ikebana becomes meditation in action, allowing her to center herself before facing difficult negotiations that could determine her family's fate. Historians still argue whether ikebana was originally a feminine art form, or whether men also practiced it in early periods. But you can see how samurai wives were uniquely positioned to develop flower arrangement into high art. They had access to expensive materials through family wealth, time to develop sophisticated techniques due to their domestic roles, and motivation to excel, because their arrangements often carried life and death messages. The seasonal symbolism of Lady Takako's arrangement operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Winter represents the current difficulties facing her family, but also the necessary dormancy period before spring renewal. The camellia's ability to bloom despite harsh conditions suggests that the Ashikaga clan possesses similar resilience. The arrangement promises that current hardships will pass, making it both realistic assessment and hopeful prophecy. You realize you're watching the birth of concepts that will influence artistic expression globally. The idea that asymmetry can be more beautiful than symmetry, that empty space can be as important as filled space, that restraint can be more powerful than abundance. Lady Takako is developing aesthetic principles that will eventually influence everything from architecture to graphic design. But right now, she's just trying to keep her family alive through turbulent political times. The technical aspects of her arrangement demonstrate sophisticated understanding of visual psychology and spatial relationships. The camellia's position creates a focal point that draws attention without demanding it. The supporting branches establish movement patterns that guide the eye through the composition in ways that feel natural rather than forced. The overall effect creates harmony between opposing elements, vertical and horizontal lines, rough and smooth textures, bold and subtle colors. As morning light shifts across the arrangement, you see how Lady Takako has calculated the changing effects of illumination throughout the day. The camellia will glow with inner fire during the morning ceremony, appear more subdued but elegant during afternoon conversations, and take on dramatic significance when evening shadows transform it into something almost mystical. She's created a work of art that changes personality according to lighting conditions, ensuring that different visitors will experience different emotional responses. The arrival of the Hasakawa representatives interrupts your contemplation of the arrangement's technical brilliance. You watch their faces as they enter the tea room and encounter Lady Takako's botanical statement. The slight pause, the appreciative nods, the careful way they position themselves to view the arrangement from optimal angles. All these responses tell Lady Takako what she needs to know about their political intentions and aesthetic sophistication. The conversation that follows uses the Ikebana arrangement as a reference point for broader discussions about resilience, beauty, and survival. The visitors compliment Lady Takako's artistic skill, but you can hear the political subtext in their comments. They're acknowledging her family's strength while also testing her responses to veiled challenges and suggestions. The flower arrangement becomes a diplomatic tool that allows dangerous topics to be discussed through aesthetic metaphor. As the ceremony concludes and the political negotiations reach successful resolution, you see the deeper purpose of Lady Takako's Ikebana mastery fulfilled. The arrangement didn't just beautify the tea room, it created psychological conditions that made productive dialogue possible between potential enemies. The beauty disarmed suspicion, the symbolism communicated complex messages efficiently, and the overall artistic statement demonstrated cultural sophistication that commanded respect. The winter light fades, but the camellia continues to glow against its supporting branches, a testament to the power of artistic expression to transcend political chaos and create moments of shared aesthetic appreciation that can change the course of history. You You sit transfixed as Lady Hojo Masako dips her brush into ink so black it seems to absorb light itself, preparing to create calligraphy that will either save her family from political destruction or provide elegant evidence of their cultured approach to honorable suicide. The rice paper stretched before her represents both canvas and battlefield, because in the world of samurai politics, a perfectly executed character can be more powerful than 1,000 mounted warriors charging into combat. Her wrist hovers above the paper with the same steady control her husband uses when preparing to strike with his katana. But instead of ending lives, she's about to create beauty that will transcend death itself. The brushstrokes she's planning will communicate messages too dangerous for spoken words, convey emotions too complex for ordinary conversation, and demonstrate mastery of cultural skills that separate true nobility from mere military power. You watch her breathing pattern as she enters the meditative state necessary for perfect calligraphy. Each inhalation centers her energy. Each exhalation releases tension that could cause trembling hands to ruin delicate brushwork. This isn't just artistic practice. It's spiritual discipline that transforms her consciousness from worried political strategist into pure creative instrument. The calligraphy becomes a form of moving meditation that provides psychological refuge from the chaos surrounding her family. The first character she creates is peace. But you can see layers of meaning in every stroke. The brush moves with authority that suggests strength rather than weakness, creating peace through power rather than submission. The character's proportions demonstrate her classical education and aesthetic sophistication, while its bold execution reveals inner confidence despite external pressures. She's not just writing a word. She's making a statement about her family's character and intentions. The mainstream historical fact about Japanese calligraphy is that it was imported from China and gradually adapted to Japanese aesthetic preferences. But here's something that might surprise you. Samurai wives were often more skilled calligraphers than their husbands because they had more time to practice, and because their domestic roles required extensive correspondence with other families, temples, and commercial partners. Lady Masako's choice of poem reveals sophisticated understanding of literary tradition and current political circumstances. She's copying verses from the Kikinchu, the classical poetry collection that every educated person knows by heart, but her selection of specific lines creates new meanings relevant to her family's situation. The poem speaks of autumn leaves falling gracefully, but in context, it suggests that honorable defeat is preferable to dishonorable survival. You notice how she varies the brush pressure to create lines that swell and narrow like breathing, giving the characters organic life that makes them seem almost alive on the paper. This technique, called brush spirit, requires years of practice to master. The variations aren't random or decorative. They follow principles that mirror natural phenomena like flowing water, growing bamboo, or wind-blown grass. Each character becomes a tiny landscape that reflects the natural world. The spacing between characters demonstrates her understanding of visual rhythm and psychological pacing. She leaves more space around emotionally significant words, allowing them to breathe and claim attention. The overall composition creates movement patterns that guide the reader's eye through the text in ways that enhance meaning and emotional impact. She's orchestrating the reader's experience with the same precision a musician uses to control tempo and dynamics. As she works, you can see how the calligraphy process affects her nervous system and emotional state. The repetitive motions activate meditative brain patterns that reduce anxiety and promote clear thinking. The focus required for perfect brushwork forces her to be completely present in the moment, providing temporary escape from worries about family survival and political strategies. Each character becomes a small victory that builds confidence for facing larger challenges. Historians still argue whether calligraphy was primarily an artistic practice or a spiritual discipline, but you can see both functions operating simultaneously in Lady Masako's work. The beauty serves contemplative purposes, while the contemplation produces beauty. She's using artistic practice as a form of prayer, creating sacred text through devotional activity that connects her to something larger than immediate political concerns. The choice of ink and paper reveals attention to detail that borders on obsession. The ink has been ground from premium ink sticks made with pine soot and animal glue, creating density and richness that will preserve the calligraphy for centuries. The paper was handmade from mulberry fibers and sized with special treatments that prevent ink from bleeding while allowing subtle gradations in tone. These material choices demonstrate both aesthetic sophistication and practical awareness that this calligraphy might outlive everyone currently in the room. You watch her create the most challenging character in the poem, Mono no Aware, the uniquely Japanese concept of bittersweet awareness of impermanence. This philosophical idea requires perfect balance between joy and sorrow, acceptance and resistance, beauty and tragedy. Her brushstrokes must embody the concept they're expressing, creating visual poetry that transcends literal meaning. The character becomes a work of art that contains entire worldviews in its elegant curves and decisive lines. The collaborative aspect of this calligraphy session deserves attention as you observe other women in the household contributing to the creative process. One wife grinds ink, while another prepares additional sheets of paper. A daughter-in-law arranges the workspace and monitors lighting conditions. They're not just helping with practical tasks, they're participating in a collective ritual that strengthens family bonds and creates shared aesthetic experiences during difficult times. As Lady Masako completes the final character, you can see the transformation that has occurred during the calligraphy session. She entered the room as a worried woman facing potential catastrophe, but she's finishing as a centered artist who has reconnected with sources of strength and beauty that transcend political circumstances. The calligraphy process has reminded her that some things, truth, beauty, artistic expression, remain valuable regardless of who wins current power struggles. The completed work will serve multiple purposes beyond its immediate aesthetic function. It will be displayed in the tea room during important ceremonies, where guests can appreciate both its artistic merit and its subtle political messages. It will be copied and sent to allies as a demonstration of the family's cultural refinement and spiritual strength. It might even be preserved in temples or literary collections, ensuring that Lady Masako's artistic legacy survives long after current political crises are forgotten. The ink is still wet, glistening on the white paper like dewdrops on morning grass, but already you can see this calligraphy taking its place in the long tradition of Japanese artistic expression that transforms personal experience into universal beauty. Lady Masako has created something that will outlive the political circumstances that inspired it, proving that art provides the ultimate victory over impermanence. You breathe deeply as Lady Tara Tokyuko lights the first stick of incense, and immediately understand why samurai wives considered fragrance to be the most dangerous of all sensory experiences. Unlike sight or sound, smell bypasses rational thought and attacks memory directly, capable of triggering emotions so intense they can transform loyal allies into deadly enemies or turn sworn enemies into devoted friends. She's about to orchestrate an olfactory symphony that will determine whether tonight's secret negotiations end in alliance or assassination. The incense burner sits in the center of the tea room like a small altar, its bronze surface decorated with dragons that seem to writhe as smoke curls upward from the precious aloes wood burning within. This isn't just any incense. It's Chiara, the highest grade of agar wood, so rare and expensive that a single piece could purchase a small army. Lady Tokyuko is literally burning wealth to create psychological effects that could save or destroy her family's political future. You watch her calculate the timing with mathematical precision. The first fragrance must establish the room's baseline atmosphere, something calming and sophisticated that demonstrates her family's refinement without overwhelming the senses. She's chosen a blend of sandalwood and jasmine that creates associations with Buddhist temples and palace gardens, subtly suggesting that her family possesses both spiritual depth and aristocratic connections. The art of incense appreciation, known as kodo, represents one of the most subtle forms of communication available to samurai wives. Unlike flower arrangements that can be seen and analyzed, or calligraphy that can be read and interpreted, fragrance operates below conscious awareness, influencing mood and memory without revealing its techniques. Lady Tokyuko can manipulate the emotional state of everyone in the room while appearing to simply beautify the environment. The mainstream historical fact about Japanese incense culture is that it was imported from China along with Buddhism and gradually developed into a sophisticated art form. But here's what most people don't realize. Samurai wives were often the most skilled incense practitioners in their households because they understood that controlling sensory environments was essential for managing the complex social dynamics that determined family survival. As the first guests arrive, you notice how their posture and facial expressions change subtly as they enter the incense-perfumed space. Shoulders relax, breathing deepens, and the hypervigilant alertness that characterizes samurai behavior softens into something more receptive. Lady Tokyuko has begun the process of chemical persuasion, using aromatic molecules to alter brain chemistry in ways that promote cooperation and trust. The second incense represents the evening's most crucial calculation. Lady Tokyuko lights a stick of precious ginkgo, creating a fragrance so complex and beautiful that it's almost impossible to analyze rationally. The scent triggers memories of childhood, temple visits, and moments of profound peace that exist in every person's psychological background. She's accessing the deepest levels of human emotional response, creating shared experiences that transcend political divisions. You observe how she varies the intensity of fragrance throughout the ceremony, understanding that olfactory adaptation requires constant subtle changes to maintain effectiveness. Too much incense becomes overwhelming and creates negative associations. Too little fails to create the desired psychological effects. She's conducting an invisible orchestra, using timing and intensity to create emotional crescendos and peaceful interludes that support the rhythm of political negotiations. The technical aspects of incense appreciation reveal sophisticated understanding of chemistry and psychology that wouldn't be formally recognized for centuries. Lady Tokyuko knows that certain fragrances promote alertness, while others induce relaxation, that some scents enhance memory while others create forgetfulness, that particular combinations can trigger specific emotional states with almost pharmaceutical precision. She's practicing a form of aromatherapy centuries before such concepts were scientifically validated. The guests begin to discuss the evening's sensitive political topics, and you can see how the incense affects their communication patterns. Voices become softer and more thoughtful. Aggressive postures shift toward openness. The harsh edges of political necessity soften into something approaching genuine friendship. Lady Tokyuko has created an atmosphere where dangerous enemies can speak honestly, without triggering defensive reactions. Historians still argue whether incense was primarily used for spiritual purposes or practical social manipulation, but you can see both functions operating simultaneously. The beauty serves sacred purposes, while the sacred experience enables practical problem solving. Lady Tokyuko is using religious traditions to create secular solutions, transforming potentially violent political conflicts into aesthetic experiences that promote peaceful resolution. The evening's most dangerous moment arrives when one guest reveals information that could destroy another guest's family if used maliciously. The room falls silent as everyone calculates the implications and potential responses. But the incense continues to work its subtle magic, maintaining an atmosphere of contemplative thoughtfulness that prevents immediate violent reactions. The fragrance has bought precious time for wisdom to override impulse. Lady Tokyuko recognizes the crisis and responds by lighting a special incense blend that she's been saving for exactly this type of emergency. The fragrance combines a losewood with rare herbs that create associations with temple ceremonies, where oaths are sworn and promises made sacred. The scent reminds everyone present of their deepest spiritual values, creating psychological pressure to choose honorable behavior over expedient violence. You realize you're witnessing the development of what would become a distinctly Japanese approach to conflict resolution through sensory manipulation. Rather than relying on logical arguments or threats of force, Lady Tokyuko is using aromatic beauty to access the parts of human consciousness that value harmony over victory, cooperation over domination. The incense creates psychological conditions where better angels of human nature can emerge. The negotiations continue through the night, but the atmosphere remains civil and productive, despite the discussion of topics that normally trigger warfare. Agreements are reached that seemed impossible when the evening began. Promises are made that will prevent bloodshed and create lasting peace between previously hostile clans. The incense has achieved what armies could not accomplish through force. As dawn approaches and the final sticks of incense burn down to ash, you see the deeper purpose of Lady Tokyuko's olfactory mastery fulfilled. The fragrance didn't just beautify the environment, it transformed human consciousness in ways that made compassion possible between natural enemies. The beauty disarmed aggression, the sacred associations inspired noble behavior, and the shared aesthetic experience created bonds that transcended political calculation. The morning light filters through the tea room windows, but the lingering traces of precious incense continue to remind everyone present of the spiritual dimensions that exist beyond immediate political concerns. You settle into the formal reception room of a prominent samurai household, watching as the lady of the house prepares for what appears to be an ordinary tea ceremony. But nothing about this gathering is ordinary. You're witnessing a masterclass in diplomatic warfare, where every gesture carries the weight of family honor and political survival. The guests arriving today include the wives of rival clans, a merchant's daughter seeking marriage arrangements, and a Buddhist nun whose temple holds significant influence over local affairs. Each woman enters knowing that alliances will be forged or shattered over the next few hours, all while maintaining the serene facade of a peaceful tea gathering. You observe how your host, Lady Matsudera, has choreographed every detail with military precision. The seating arrangement alone tells a complex story. Placing the merchant's daughter closest to the tokonoma alcove signals respect for her family's growing wealth, while positioning the rival clan's representative, where she must bow deepest during the ceremony, subtly reinforces social hierarchy. The tea bowls selected for each guest aren't random choices, but but carefully calculated messages. The antique raku bowl for the Buddhist nun acknowledges her spiritual authority, while the newer but more expensive piece reserved for the merchant's daughter recognizes economic power over traditional prestige. As the ceremony begins, you watch Lady Matsudera navigate conversations that would make modern diplomats sweat. When the rival clan's wife mentions her husband's recent military victories, your host responds by praising the quality of tea leaves imported from that region, deflecting potential boasting while acknowledging territorial control without appearing subservient. It's verbal aikido, using an opponent's energy against them while maintaining perfect composure. Historians still argue whether these tea ceremony negotiations actually prevented conflicts or merely postponed them. But you can see the immediate tension diffusing as shared appreciation for aesthetic beauty creates common ground. The real politics emerge during the mizuya, the preparation phase where guests traditionally assist the host. You notice how Lady Matsudera assigns tasks based on complex social calculations. Allowing the merchant's daughter to handle expensive utensils demonstrates trust, while teaching her proper protocols. While asking the rival's wife to arrange flowers for the tokonoma gives her a position of honor that costs nothing, but yields diplomatic dividends. These women understand that in a world where their husbands settle disputes with swords, they must master subtler weapons. You're fascinated by how tea ceremony etiquette provides cover for information gathering that would make spy networks envious. When Lady Matsudera compliments a guest's kimono, she's not just being polite, she's noting which silk merchants the family patronizes, indicating their trade relationships and economic alliances. The seemingly innocent question about where someone learned a particular tea preparation technique reveals educational backgrounds, family connections, and regional loyalties. Every casual observation about seasonal decorations or incense choices builds a detailed intelligence picture of each family's resources, preferences, and vulnerabilities. The conversation turns to arranging marriages for various daughters and sons, and you realize you're watching a high-stakes negotiation disguised as maternal concern. Lady Matsudera mentions her eldest son's accomplishments while serving particularly excellent sweets, creating positive associations between her family's prospects and sensory pleasure. When discussing potential matches, she uses tea ceremony metaphors that everyone understands, describing compatibility as harmony between host and guest, or noting that some matches might be like forcing spring flowers into autumn arrangements. These coded discussions allow for frank negotiations while maintaining face for all parties involved. You notice how conflicts that might elsewhere explode into public feuds get diffused through ritualized tea ceremony protocols. When two guests disagree about their daughter's relative accomplishments, Lady Matsudera redirects attention to the beauty of the current season's tea implements, reminding everyone that true refinement lies in appreciating present beauty rather than competing over achievements. The rigid structure of tea ceremony provides face-saving ways to back down from confrontations. Someone can yield gracefully by deferring to proper protocol rather than appearing to lose an argument. The economic negotiations happening here would impress Wall Street traders, though you'd never guess it from the serene atmosphere. Discussion of tea quality often masks conversations about trade routes and merchant relationships, while compliments about someone's tea implements open negotiations for loans or business partnerships. Lady Matsudera mentions needing certain rare tea varieties, prompting offers from guests who control different supply chains, creating mutual obligations that will influence future political decisions. These women understand that economic interdependence creates stronger bonds than military alliances. As the ceremony concludes, you watch the careful choreography of departure, where the order of leaving reinforces the social agreements reached during tea. The rival clan's wife departs with a small gift of tea leaves from Lady Matsudera's personal collection. A gesture that acknowledges their family's relationship has shifted from hostility toward cautious cooperation. The merchant's daughter receives instruction on a particular whisking technique, creating obligation for future visits that will advance marriage negotiations. Every farewell carries diplomatic weight, cementing the afternoon's achievements. You realize that for samurai wives, the tea ceremony wasn't just cultural refinement. It was their primary tool for political survival in a world where women couldn't participate directly in official negotiations. Through mastering these protocols, they created informal power networks that often proved more durable than their husbands' military alliances. While samurai men fought for territory and honor, their wives fought for family security and social position using weapons of beauty, hospitality, and shared aesthetic appreciation. The sophistication of this system becomes clear as you consider its lasting impact. These diplomatic skills, honed through generations of tea ceremony practice, created Japanese cultural patterns that persist today. The emphasis on consensus building, face-saving negotiation techniques, and the power of shared aesthetic experiences to bridge differences. You step into the private chambers where Lady Takeda manages what amounts to a complex import business, though she'd never use such crude commercial language. Spread across low tables are account books written in elegant calligraphy, recording expenses that would bankrupt most modern households. The numbers tell a staggering story. A single tea bowl crafted by a master potter costs more than a foot soldier's annual salary, while the rare matcha powder she serves during important ceremonies represents the equivalent of several horses or a small rice field. You're witnessing the intersection of aesthetic refinement and brutal economic reality, where samurai wives somehow balance their family's spiritual and cultural needs against financial resources stretched thin by constant military campaigns. The ledgers reveal fascinating details about the tea economy that most people never consider. That precious iron kettle hanging in the tea room. It cost enough to equip 5 Ashigaru spearmen with armor and weapons. The bamboo tea scoop carved by a famous tea master represents 3 months of a skilled craftsman's wages. Lady Takeda notes every expenditure with precision that would impress modern accountants, tracking not just purchase prices, but ongoing costs. The special charcoal for heating water, the specific types of incense for seasonal ceremonies, the delicate papers needed for storing different tea varieties. You realize these women weren't just cultural patrons, but sophisticated financial managers operating in a luxury market that demanded both aesthetic expertise and hard-nosed business sense. You watch Lady Takeda negotiate with tea merchants who have traveled from distant provinces, their pack horses loaded with ceramic treasures and exotic tea varieties. The conversation flows like a formal dance, discussing the poetic qualities of different tea flavors, while simultaneously haggling over prices with ruthless efficiency. When she praises the spring morning clarity of a particular matcha grade, she's not just being lyrical, she's demonstrating knowledge that justifies negotiating better terms. These merchants know they can't deceive someone who understands both the aesthetic and economic value of their goods. The markup between wholesale and ceremonial prices often reached 500%, making tea ceremonies expensive as luxury car purchases in modern terms. The seasonal scheduling of purchases reveals another layer of economic sophistication. Lady Takeda must coordinate buying with the agricultural calendar, purchasing new tea harvests when prices are lowest while still maintaining quality standards that satisfy her guests' refined palates. She maintains relationships with multiple suppliers to ensure reliable access during political disruptions, a crucial strategy when trade routes often became battlefields. You see her carefully balancing immediate needs against long-term investments, sometimes purchasing expensive pieces during financially difficult periods, because she knows their value will appreciate, while their availability might disappear if artisans die or workshops get destroyed during conflicts. Historians still argue whether the tea ceremony economy represented wasteful luxury or crucial cultural investment, but you can see how these purchases served multiple functions beyond aesthetic pleasure. That expensive tea bowl doubles as a diplomatic gift that can seal important alliances, while the rare incense creates memorable experiences that influence political negotiations. Lady Takeda isn't just buying beautiful objects. She's investing in social capital that provides her family with influence networks money alone couldn't purchase. The tea ceremony creates a luxury economy where cultural refinement translates directly into political power. You're amazed by the creative financing strategies these women develop to support their tea practices. Lady Takeda maintains a complex lending network with other samurai wives, trading access to rare implements for temporary loans during cash-poor periods. She's developed relationships with merchant families who provide credit in exchange for social access. Their daughters gain tea ceremony training, while their businesses benefit from samurai family endorsements. Some items get purchased collectively by groups of friends, with elaborate schedules for sharing expensive pieces during different seasons or ceremonies. It's medieval crowdfunding, allowing multiple families to enjoy luxury items none could afford individually. The international aspects of tea economics reveal Japan's early globalization. Lady Takeda's account books track shipments from China and Korea, noting how political tensions affect supply chains and prices. A border skirmish between China and Korea might double the cost of certain ceramic types, while diplomatic missions create opportunities for rare purchases. She must understand currency fluctuations, shipping costs, and international politics just to maintain her family's tea ceremony standards. You realize these samurai wives were among Japan's most sophisticated international traders, though they'd never acknowledge such commercial language. The connection between military expenses and tea ceremony costs creates constant tension in household budgets. When Lord Takeda needs new armor or additional weapons for his retainers, something from the tea ceremony budget must be sacrificed. Lady Takeda has developed elaborate prioritization systems, which ceremonies absolutely require expensive materials versus which can manage with older or less precious implements. She maintains detailed records of which guests notice quality differences, allowing her to economize strategically without losing face. During military campaigns, tea ceremony expenses often drop to near zero, but she must resume full hospitality immediately when her husband returns, regardless of campaign costs. The apprenticeship economy surrounding tea ceremonies creates additional financial complexity. Lady Takeda sponsors promising young artisans, providing materials and workspace in exchange for exclusive access to their best works. She maintains relationships with aging masters, ensuring her family's access to their final creations while providing them with financial security. These investments often pay long-term dividends as sponsored artists gain fame, making their early works increasingly valuable. It's cultural venture capital, requiring artistic judgment alongside financial acumen. You observe how Lady Takeda manages the delicate balance between personal taste and resale value. Some purchases reflect pure aesthetic passion, pieces that speak to her artistic sensibilities regardless of their market price. Others represent calculated investments in items likely to appreciate or provide diplomatic advantages. The most expensive purchases often combine both factors, acquiring pieces that satisfy her personal standards while maintaining their economic value for potential future sales during financial emergencies. The seasonal ceremony calendar creates predictable expense cycles that require careful cash flow management. Spring tea ceremonies demand fresh seasonal decorations and new utensils, while autumn gatherings require different implements and preparations. Lady Takedom must anticipate these costs months in advance, coordinating with suppliers and managing household finance. You kneel quietly in the corner of the practice room, watching 10-year-old Lady Chiyo attempt her first formal tea ceremony under her mother's watchful eye. The little girl's hands shake slightly as she lifts the delicate tea bowl, and you can see the weight of centuries pressing down on her small shoulders. This isn't just a childhood lesson. You're witnessing the transmission of cultural DNA that will shape Japan's aesthetic soul for generations to come. Lady Matsuko, Chiyo's mother, corrects each movement with infinite patience, understanding that she's not just teaching tea preparation, but sculpting a future guardian of traditions that might otherwise vanish in an era when samurai culture itself faces constant threat from warfare and social upheaval. The training begins before dawn, when young girls learn to appreciate subtle differences in seasonal changes that will later influence their ceremony choices. Lady Chiyo must identify which flowers bloom in specific months, understand how weather affects tea quality, and recognize the emotional qualities of different incense varieties. You watch her struggle to articulate why spring water tastes different from autumn water, learning vocabulary that connects sensory experience with poetic expression. These lessons aren't academic exercises. They're building the foundation of aesthetic sensitivity that will allow her to create meaningful ceremonies throughout her adult life. The physical training resembles martial arts more than modern people expect. Lady Chiyo practices the same bow hundreds of times until muscle memory makes it naturally graceful, while her footwork during ceremony setup must be precise enough to move efficiently in confined spaces without disturbing the meditative atmosphere. You see her wincing as she maintains uncomfortable kneeling positions for extended periods, building the physical stamina necessary for hosting lengthy gatherings. Her mother explains that ceremony movements aren't arbitrary, but developed through centuries of refinement. Each gesture serves practical purposes while creating aesthetic harmony that soothes both host and guests. The memorization requirements would challenge university students. Lady Chiyo must learn the proper treatment for dozens of different tea implements, understanding not just their physical care, but their historical significance and appropriate seasonal usage. She recites genealogies of famous tea masters, memorizes poetry appropriate for different ceremonies, and studies the subtle protocol differences required when hosting various social ranks. Historians still argue whether this emphasis on memorization enhanced or limited creative expression, but you can see how it provides a solid foundation that allows later improvisation within established frameworks. You're fascinated by how mothers adapt teaching methods to their daughters' individual personalities and talents. Lady Matsuko recognizes that Chiyo has natural artistic sensitivity, but struggles with social confidence. So she emphasizes how ceremony mastery provides structure that supports natural shyness rather than fighting against it. Other mothers you observe take different approaches, encouraging bold daughters to find subtlety within tea ceremony restraints, or helping practical-minded girls discover the deep logic underlying seemingly arbitrary protocols. These women understand that cookie-cutter training produces mediocre results, while personalized instruction creates masters who innovate within tradition. The seasonal training schedule reveals sophisticated pedagogical planning. Spring lessons focus on renewal and fresh beginnings, teaching girls to create ceremonies that celebrate natural cycles and human transitions. Summer training emphasizes endurance and maintaining grace under difficult conditions, learning to host ceremonies during hot weather while wearing formal clothing that would overwhelm modern air-conditioned comfort. Autumn instruction concentrates on appreciation and gratitude, understanding how aesthetic practices help process life, inevitable losses and changes. Winter sessions teach resourcefulness and finding beauty in limitation, essential skills for maintaining ceremonies during lean periods when resources are scarce. Economic education integrates seamlessly with aesthetic training. Lady Chiyo learns to evaluate tea quality not just for flavor but for value, understanding how seasonal availability affects pricing and how political disruptions influence supply chains. She practices negotiating with merchants while maintaining proper social hierarchy, learning to achieve favorable terms without appearing overly commercial. These skills will prove essential when she manages her own household budget, balancing cultural obligations against financial constraints that could bankrupt families lacking proper economic judgment. You observe advanced students learning diplomatic applications that would impress modern negotiation experts. Teenage girls practice reading subtle social cues during mock ceremonies, learning to identify tension between guests and deploy appropriate intervention techniques. They study case histories of famous tea ceremony negotiations, analyzing how their predecessors used aesthetic experiences to bridge political differences or diffuse dangerous conflicts. These lessons acknowledge that ceremony mastery isn't just cultural refinement, but practical survival skill in a world where women's political influence operates through informal channels. The mistake correction process reveals deep understanding of learning psychology. When Lady Chiyo makes errors, her mother doesn't simply point out problems, but guides discovery of underlying principles that will prevent similar mistakes in the future. A poorly timed movement leads to discussion of rhythm and natural flow, while inappropriate implement choices prompt exploration of seasonal symbolism and guest psychology. This approach develops independent judgment rather than mere rule following, preparing girls to adapt traditions creatively when circumstances require innovation. Regional variations in training reflect different clan priorities and local customs. Families in border regions emphasize portable ceremony skills that maintain cultural practices during military campaigns, while urban households focus on sophisticated hospitality techniques suitable for complex political environments. Some mothers specialize in particular ceremony schools, while others teach eclectic approaches that draw from multiple traditions. You realize that despite surface uniformity, tea ceremony education was highly diverse, preparing girls for the specific challenges they'd face in their family circumstances. The emotional dimensions of training address unique pressures facing samurai daughters. These girls must learn to find inner peace despite living in constant awareness that their fathers and brothers might die in battle at any moment. Tea ceremony practice provides structured meditation that helps process anxiety and grief, while maintaining social composure essential for family stability. Lady Matsuko explains that ceremony skills offer daughters a form of personal strength that external circumstances cannot destroy. Even during sieges or exile, knowledge of tea traditions provides psychological anchor and identity continuity. Assessment methods reveal sophisticated understanding of competency evaluation. Rather than formal tests, mothers observe daughters during real ceremonies with actual guests, noting not just technical accuracy, but social sensitivity and creative adaptation to unexpected situations. The ultimate graduation occurs when a daughter successfully hosts her first independent ceremony, demonstrating mastery of technical skills, social protocols, and aesthetic judgment necessary for maintaining family cultural standards throughout. You crouch in the corner of a makeshift shelter as arrows whistle overhead, watching Lady Yamamoto carefully arrange a tiny portable tea set on a piece of silk cloth spread across the dirt floor. Outside, her husband's castle endures its third week under siege. But inside this cramped space, she's creating a moment of transcendent calm that defies the chaos surrounding her. The irony isn't lost on you. While enemy forces try to destroy everything her family represents, she's preserving the essence of their culture through a ceremony that requires nothing more than hot water, powdered tea, and unshakable inner composure. You're witnessing how samurai wives transformed tea ceremonies from elaborate peacetime rituals into portable practices that could provide spiritual sustenance during humanity's darkest moments. The equipment tells a story of ingenious adaptation to impossible circumstances. Lady Yamamoto's wartime tea kit fits into a small lacquered box that could easily be mistaken for a military field ration. Instead of precious ceramic bowls, she uses simple wooden cups that won't shatter when the castle walls shake from artillery impacts. Her tea scoop is carved from bamboo found in the castle gardens, while her whisk is made from split bamboo that doubles as emergency kindling if fuel runs short. You realize these women didn't abandon their cultural practices during warfare. They distilled them down to their absolute essence, proving that true refinement lies in spirit rather than expensive materials. The timing of wartime ceremonies reveals profound psychological understanding. Lady Yamamoto doesn't schedule formal gatherings during active combat, but she creates brief ceremonial moments during lulls when exhausted defenders need spiritual restoration more than physical rest. After particularly brutal fighting, she appears with her simple tea service, offering not just warm liquid but ritualized comfort that helps traumatized warriors process experiences that would otherwise shatter their sanity. The ceremony structure provides familiar patterns that anchor identity when everything else feels chaotic and uncertain. You watch her adapt traditional protocols to emergency conditions with creativity that would impress modern disaster relief specialists. The formal seating arrangements become impossible in cramped quarters, so she develops modified procedures that maintain ceremonial dignity while accommodating practical constraints. When proper water heating equipment isn't available, she learns to judge temperature by sound and steam patterns from improvised braziers made from salvaged metal. The seasonal decorations that normally grace tea ceremonies get replaced by whatever natural beauty she can find. A single flower growing between stone blocks, or interesting shadows cast by arrow slits in the castle walls. The social dynamics of wartime tea ceremonies reveal their crucial role in maintaining morale and community cohesion. Lady Yamamoto's gatherings include not just noble wives but serving women, craftsmen's wives, and even common soldiers when circumstances permit. These ceremonies create temporary equality, where social rank matters less than shared humanity facing mortal danger. You see how the ritualized sharing of tea breaks down normal hierarchy barriers, allowing honest conversation about fears and hopes that formal military structure couldn't accommodate. Historians still argue whether these democratic elements influenced later social changes, but their immediate psychological benefits are unmistakable. The resource management required for wartime ceremonies demonstrates remarkable efficiency and creativity. Lady Yamamoto carefully rations her tea supplies, calculating how to maintain ceremonial practices throughout a siege of unknown duration, while ensuring fair distribution among participants. She develops techniques for extending tea supplies by mixing precious matcha with locally foraged herbs that add nutritional value while maintaining ceremonial significance. When traditional charcoal runs out, she experiments with different burning materials, learning to create proper heating conditions using wood scraps and paper salvaged from damaged buildings. Communication becomes a crucial aspect of siege-time ceremonies, as these gatherings provide opportunities for sharing information and coordinating activities that military command structures might overlook. Lady Yamamoto's tea sessions become informal intelligence briefings, where participants share observations about enemy movements, discuss resource conservation strategies, and coordinate care for wounded defenders. The ceremonial setting encourages honest assessment of situations that participants might not discuss in formal military meetings, providing leaders with more accurate information about morale and practical conditions. You observe how ceremony practices help maintain cultural continuity when normal educational activities become impossible. During quieter moments, Lady Yamamoto continues teaching younger women and girls basic tea ceremony principles, adapting lessons to current circumstances while preserving essential knowledge for future generations. These impromptu classes serve multiple purposes: maintaining traditional skills, providing distraction from siege stress, and ensuring cultural survival even if the current generation doesn't survive the conflict. The girls learn not just tea preparation but resilience, finding beauty and meaning even in desperate circumstances. The psychological benefits of maintaining aesthetic practices during extreme stress become clearly apparent as you watch ceremony participants. The familiar ritual movements provide meditative focus that helps calm anxiety and process trauma, while the shared aesthetic experience creates temporary mental escape from brutal realities. Participants often emerge from brief ceremonies with renewed strength and clearer thinking, better prepared to handle whatever challenges the siege brings next. You realize these women understood intuitively what modern psychology has scientifically verified: that maintaining meaningful rituals helps preserve mental health during extended periods of severe stress. Regional variations in wartime adaptations reflect different strategic situations and local resources. Coastal castle sieges allow ceremonies incorporating seaweed and salt water, while mountain fortresses develop practices using pine needles and snow. Some families create portable ceremony kits designed for rapid evacuation, while others focus on making the most of whatever materials siege conditions provide. These innovations demonstrate how samurai wives balance tradition preservation with practical adaptation, ensuring cultural survival regardless of military outcomes. The spiritual dimensions of wartime ceremonies take on heightened significance when death becomes a daily possibility. Lady Yamamoto's gatherings often include prayers for fallen defenders and blessing rituals for those preparing for battle, transforming tea ceremonies into deeply religious experiences that help participants find meaning in sacrifice and suffering. The meditation aspects become more intense, providing tools for accepting mortality while maintaining courage and purpose. These practices help participants distinguish between fear, which is natural and manageable, and despair, which destroys effectiveness and honor. The legacy of wartime ceremony adaptations influenced peacetime practices long after conflicts ended. Techniques developed during sieges created simplified ceremony variations that proved popular among families with limited resources or time constraints. The democratic elements pioneered during emergencies gradually influenced normal social protocols, while the psychological insights gained during extreme. You find yourself traveling the ancient highways of feudal Japan, moving from province to province as if carried by invisible currents that reveal how tea ceremony traditions adapted to vastly different regional conditions and family preferences. In the mountainous domains of northern Honshu, you watch Lady Sadek perform ceremonies that emphasize rustic simplicity and seasonal awareness, using locally crafted pottery that celebrates imperfections as expressions of natural beauty. Her tea implements reflect the harsh climate and practical needs of mountain life. Thick ceramic bowls that retain heat during bitter winters, charcoal braziers designed to maximize warmth efficiency, and decorations featuring pine branches and snow crystals that acknowledge rather than escape the challenging environment. You're witnessing how geography shapes culture, as these mountain ceremonies develop characteristics distinctly different from their lowland counterparts. Travel south to the warm coastal regions, and you discover ceremonies that seem to belong to a different cultural universe despite sharing the same fundamental principles. Lady Shimazu's Satsuma domain celebrations incorporate tropical elements that would seem exotic to northern practitioners. Ceremonies timed with monsoon seasons, decorations featuring southern flowers unknown in colder climates, and tea preparation techniques adapted to humid conditions that would ruin traditional methods. The regional pottery reflects local clay composition and firing techniques, creating distinctive glazes and textures that identify their geographic origins as clearly as accents identify speech patterns. You realize that Japanese tea ceremony traditions weren't monolithic, but represented a diverse archipelago of related practices, each adapted to specific environmental and cultural conditions. The Kansai region around Kyoto and Osaka develops tea ceremony variations that emphasize sophisticated urban refinement, reflecting the political and cultural complexity of Japan's ancient capitals. Here you observe Lady Hasakawa hosting ceremonies that incorporate rare imported materials and demonstrate knowledge of continental aesthetics, showing influences from Chinese and Korean traditions filtered through centuries of Japanese adaptation. The urban environment allows access to exotic ingredients and luxury materials impossible in remote provinces, creating ceremony styles that emphasize technical precision and aesthetic complexity. These metropolitan variations often influence provincial practices, spreading innovations through networks of marriage alliances and cultural exchange that connect regional variations into a broader national tradition. The merchant-dominated regions develop their own distinctive approaches that balance traditional protocols with practical commercial realities. In Sakai and other trading centers, you watch samurai wives adapt ceremonies to accommodate merchant family sensibilities while maintaining warrior class dignity. Lady Takayama's gatherings feature expensive materials that demonstrate wealth, while incorporating aesthetic elements that appeal to merchant tastes for substantial luxury, rather than subtle refinement. These ceremonies must navigate complex social terrain where traditional hierarchy conflicts with economic reality, creating hybrid practices that acknowledge changing power relationships while preserving cultural essentials. Border regions facing constant military threats develop ceremony variations, emphasizing portability and resource efficiency. Along the northern frontiers, where conflicts with indigenous populations require constant military preparedness, tea ceremonies become streamlined affairs that can be assembled quickly and transported easily. Lady Dates ceremonies use minimal equipment and flexible protocols that adapt to military camp conditions, creating traditions that maintain cultural identity even during extended campaigns. These border adaptations influence ceremonial development throughout Japan, proving that practical innovation often drives aesthetic evolution. Historians still argue whether regional variations represent authentic local traditions or simply practical adaptations to different circumstances. But you can see how geographic conditions create distinctive aesthetic sensibilities that persist across generations. Mountain regions develop appreciation for subtle seasonal changes and natural textures, while coastal areas emphasize color contrasts and weather adaptation. Urban centers focus on technical refinement and cultural complexity, while rural areas value resourcefulness and connection to agricultural cycles. These regional characteristics become self-reinforcing as local training traditions emphasize particular aesthetic values that reflect environmental conditions. The establishment of different ceremony schools often reflects regional preferences and family traditions that become codified into formal systems. You observe how the Eurasian school's emphasis on accessibility and flexibility appeals to regions with diverse social conditions, while the more formal Amotsenk traditions prove popular in areas with stable social hierarchies and adequate resources. The Mushikadaisink school's focus on innovation and personal expression attracts families in changing regions where adaptation becomes essential for cultural survival. These schools don't compete so much as serve different regional needs and aesthetic preferences. Seasonal ceremony calendars vary dramatically between regions, reflecting local climate patterns and agricultural cycles that determine when different activities become practical or meaningful. Northern regions compress their formal ceremony seasons into shorter periods when weather permits elaborate gatherings, while southern areas spread activities throughout longer temperate periods. Mountain regions time ceremonies with hunting seasons and harvest cycles that differ from coastal areas focused on fishing and maritime trade. You realize that ceremony scheduling isn't arbitrary, but reflects deep understanding of how natural cycles affect human activities and emotional states. The transmission of regional techniques occurs through marriage networks that connect different areas while preserving local distinctiveness. When Lady Megami marries into a distant province, she brings northern ceremony techniques that gradually influence local practices while adapting to new environmental conditions. These cultural exchanges create hybrid practices that combine elements from different regions, slowly evolving into new traditions that reflect their mixed heritage. The process resembles biological evolution, with successful adaptations spreading while less effective combinations disappear. Regional material cultures significantly influence ceremony development as local crafts traditions create distinctive implements and decorations that shape aesthetic sensibilities. Regions famous for particular pottery styles develop ceremony variations that showcase local artistic achievements, while areas known for metalworking or woodcraft incorporate those specialties into their tea ceremony equipment. You watch Lady Mita's ceremonies feature Kaga province lacquerware that influences her color preferences and seasonal timing, while Lady Kuroda's gatherings highlight Chikuzen pottery that shapes her aesthetic choices in ways that wouldn't occur to practitioners from different regions. The economic factors underlying regional variations reveal how resource availability shapes cultural expression in ways that participants might not consciously recognize. Wealthy regions develop ceremony variations that emphasize expensive materials and complex preparations, while economically challenged areas create equally sophisticated practices using simpler resources. These economic adaptations often prove more durable than luxury variations, surviving political changes and economic disruption that destroy more elaborate traditions. You observe how regional ceremony variations reflect not just aesthetic preferences, but economic realities that determine which practices can be sustained across generations. Trade route influences create ceremony corridors where practices spread along commercial networks, creating regional clusters that share characteristics despite geographic separation. The Takeda road system carries ceremony innovations between Edo and Kyoto, while sea routes spread island variations throughout coastal regions. You realize that cultural geography follows economic geography, with ceremony variations spreading along the same networks that carry goods and political information. You stand at the threshold of a new era, watching Lady Tokugawa Yashiko carefully pack away her family's most precious tea ceremony implements, as the world she's known for centuries crumbles around her. The year is 1868, and Emperor Meiji's restoration has officially ended the samurai age. But you're witnessing something far more profound than political change. You're seeing how samurai wives become the final guardians of traditions that modernizing Japan seems determined to abandon. Outside her mansion windows, gas streetlights are replacing paper lanterns. Western clothing is becoming fashionable among the younger generation, and her own sons are cutting off their top knots to embrace foreign customs. Yet here in her private chambers, Lady Yashiko continues practicing the ancient arts that defined her identity, transforming from privileged practitioner into cultural custodian fighting to preserve knowledge that might otherwise vanish forever. The practical challenges facing traditional ceremony practice in Meiji Japan would overwhelm less determined women. The new government's westernization policies actively discourage many traditional customs as backward and embarrassing, while economic upheaval makes maintaining expensive ceremony practices increasingly difficult for former samurai families stripped of their hereditary incomes. Lady Yashiko watches her neighbors sell precious tea implements to survive financially, each transaction representing centuries of accumulated cultural knowledge dispersing into private collections or foreign museums. You see her making desperate calculations. Which pieces can be sold to maintain basic household expenses versus which items are so culturally essential that losing them would represent irreparable damage to tradition itself. The social pressures prove equally challenging as younger generations embrace Western customs with enthusiasm that borders on fanaticism. Lady Yashiko's daughters question whether learning traditional tea ceremony skills will serve any purpose in a modernizing world that increasingly values Western education and career opportunities over domestic cultural achievements. Their arguments aren't entirely wrong. The new society offers women unprecedented educational and professional opportunities that traditional training doesn't prepare them for. Yet you watch this wise woman arguing that cultural knowledge represents a form of wealth that survives political changes and economic disruptions, providing identity anchors when rapid social change threatens to wash away everything familiar and meaningful. The adaptation strategies these women develop reveal remarkable creativity and determination in preserving traditions under hostile conditions. Lady Yashiko begins teaching tea ceremony skills to merchant and craftsman families who previously couldn't access such refined training, recognizing that cultural survival requires expanding beyond traditional class boundaries. She simplifies certain ceremony elements to make them accessible to families lacking expensive implements, while carefully preserving essential principles that maintain authentic traditional character. These adaptations require delicate balancing, making practices accessible enough to survive, while maintaining standards high enough to preserve meaningful cultural content. You observe how former samurai wives transform into cultural entrepreneurs, creating new economic models that support traditional practices in a modernizing economy. Lady Yashiko establishes a tea ceremony school that charges tuition to support her family while preserving traditional knowledge, pioneering educational approaches that will eventually evolve into the formal schools that dominate modern Japanese tea ceremony instruction. Other women you encounter develop related businesses, selling traditional implements, providing ceremony services for special occasions, or creating simplified ceremony versions suitable for modern urban lifestyles. These innovations represent more than economic necessity. They're cultural preservation strategy disguised as commercial enterprises. Historians still argue whether Meiji period adaptations preserved authentic traditional practices or created entirely new cultural forms that merely resembled historical ceremonies. But you can see how these women prioritized cultural continuity over historical purity. Lady Yashiko understands that living traditions must evolve to survive, and that rigid adherence to historical forms would guarantee cultural death in rapidly changing circumstances. Her modifications preserve essential spiritual and aesthetic principles, while adapting surface details to contemporary conditions, ensuring that future generations inherit meaningful practices rather than empty historical curiosities. The international dimensions of cultural preservation create unexpected opportunities alongside obvious challenges. Foreign interest in Japanese traditional arts provides new audiences and economic support for practices that domestic society might otherwise abandon, while international exhibitions and cultural exchanges offer platforms for demonstrating traditional skills to appreciative audiences. Lady Yashiko participates in cultural demonstrations for foreign visitors, finding that explaining Japanese traditions to outsiders helps clarify their essential characteristics and contemporary relevance. These international connections create global networks that support traditional practice preservation, even when domestic support falters. The educational system changes force fundamental reconsiderations of how traditional knowledge gets transmitted to future generations. With formal education increasingly emphasizing Western subjects and practical skills, traditional arts education must find new institutional forms or risk disappearing entirely. Lady Yashiko works with other traditionalists to establish private schools and cultural organizations that provide systematic instruction in tea ceremony principles, creating institutional structures that can survive individual family disruptions. These efforts lay foundations for the cultural preservation organizations that will sustain traditional arts throughout Japan's modern period. The psychological dimensions of cultural preservation during rapid social change reveal how traditional practices provide stability anchors during periods of dramatic disruption. Lady Yashiko's tea ceremony sessions offer participants brief respites from the anxiety and confusion that accompany rapid modernization, providing familiar rituals that maintain connection to cultural identity when everything else feels uncertain. The meditative aspects of ceremony practice help participants process the stress of social change while maintaining confidence in their cultural worth, despite foreign criticism of traditional customs as primitive or outdated. The documentation efforts undertaken by traditionalist women during this period prove crucial for long-term cultural preservation. Recognizing that oral transmission methods might not survive modern social disruptions, Lady Yashiko begins creating written records of ceremony procedures, philosophical principles, and historical information that previous generations transmitted through direct training relationships. These documentation projects require translating embodied knowledge into written form, forcing practitioners to articulate aspects of traditional practice that were previously understood intuitively. The resulting texts become foundations for modern tea ceremony instruction and scholarly study. Regional variations in adaptation strategies reflect different local conditions and political circumstances affecting traditional practice preservation. Urban areas with strong foreign presence often develop cosmopolitan approaches that emphasize international appreciation for Japanese traditions, while rural regions focus on maintaining practices within traditional community structures. Some former domains actively support cultural preservation as expressions of regional identity, while others embrace modernization so completely that traditional practices nearly disappear. You observe how political and economic conditions create vastly different outcomes for cultural preservation efforts across different regions. The generational conflicts over cultural preservation reveal fundamental tensions between tradition and progress that define modern Japanese identity. Lady Yashiko must navigate between elderly traditionalists who resist any modifications to historical practices and younger family members who question whether traditional knowledge has any relevance in modern society. She develops sophisticated arguments about why cultural traditions deserve preservation, not as museum pieces, but as living practices that provide psychological resources and aesthetic education valuable in any historical period. Her conversations with skeptical daughters and granddaughters force her to articulate benefits of traditional training that previous generations took for granted, creating philosophical foundations for modern traditional arts education. The economic innovations developed during this transition period establish patterns that sustain traditional arts throughout Japan's modern development. Lady Yashiko's school model, combining authentic traditional instruction with accessible pricing and practical scheduling, becomes the template for countless similar institutions that make traditional arts available to modern urban populations. The commercial aspects that initially seemed like compromises with tradition actually create sustainable economic foundations that prove more durable than the hereditary support systems that sustained traditional arts during the feudal period. You realize that far from representing cultural decline, the Meiji period challenges forced traditional arts to evolve in ways that ultimately strengthen their long-term survival prospects. The democratization required for economic sustainability makes traditional practices available to broader populations who become invested in their preservation, while the documentation efforts create knowledge bases that survive individual family disruptions. The international attention validates traditional arts' cultural value while creating global support networks. And you settle into a quiet corner of a modern Tokyo tea ceremony studio, watching elderly Tanaka-sensei guide her students through movements that carry the genetic memory of countless samurai wives who mastered these same principles centuries ago. The fluorescent lights and concrete walls couldn't be more different from the wooden castles and paper screens of feudal Japan. Yet something profound remains unchanged as you witness how the discipline, mindfulness, and aesthetic sensitivity cultivated by those ancient women continues to shape lives in our hyper-connected, anxiety-ridden modern world. The young businesswoman kneeling beside you checks her smartphone between ceremony segments, her fingers still trembling slightly from the stock market stress that drove her to seek traditional meditation practices. You're witnessing the ultimate victory of those samurai wives. Their teachings have survived not just political upheaval and social transformation, but the complete reconstruction of human civilization itself. The core principles these women developed continue solving problems that didn't even exist in their historical period. That businesswoman's smartphone anxiety would baffle a medieval samurai wife, but the mindfulness techniques embedded in tea ceremony practice address the underlying psychological patterns that create stress regardless of its technological source. The careful attention to present moment awareness that samurai wives cultivated to navigate political dangers now helps modern practitioners manage information overload and decision fatigue. The aesthetic sensitivity they develop to create harmonious social atmospheres translates directly into leadership skills valuable in contemporary professional environments. You realize these women weren't just preserving cultural traditions. They were developing human potential enhancement techniques that remain relevant across centuries of technological change. The international influence of Japanese tea ceremony reveals how samurai wives' innovations spread far beyond their original cultural context. You observe students from dozens of countries learning movement patterns and philosophical principles that originated in medieval Japanese castles, finding universal applicability in teachings that seemed culturally specific. The emphasis on finding beauty in simplicity appeals to minimalism movements worldwide, while the focus on seasonal awareness resonates with environmental consciousness spreading globally. Corporate executives attend tea ceremony workshops to learn patience and attention to detail, while artists study traditional aesthetic principles to understand how subtle variations create powerful emotional impacts. Modern psychology validates insights that samurai wives developed through centuries of practical experience. The meditative aspects of ceremony practice activate the same neurological pathways that contemporary mindfulness therapies target for treating anxiety and depression. The social protocols they created for managing conflicts through aesthetic experiences align with current understanding of how shared positive activities build trust and cooperation. The emphasis on accepting imperfection as part of natural beauty anticipates psychological approaches that help people develop resilience and self-compassion. You see how their empirical discoveries about human nature anticipated scientific findings by hundreds of years. The therapeutic applications of traditional tea ceremony principles address distinctly modern psychological challenges. Urban isolation, career pressure, and digital overstimulation create mental health problems that respond remarkably well to practices originally designed for managing feudal political stress. The structured social interaction provides antidotes to loneliness, while the focus on physical coordination offers relief from intellectual overwhelm. The seasonal awareness connects urban dwellers to natural cycles they've lost touch with, while the emphasis on impermanence provides perspective on temporary setbacks that might otherwise seem overwhelming. Tanaka-sensei explains that her students often discover these ancient practices address contemporary problems more effectively than modern solutions specifically designed for current issues. Historians still argue whether contemporary tea ceremony represents authentic traditional practice or modern adaptation that merely borrows historical forms. But you can see how the essential principles remain remarkably consistent across centuries of change. The emphasis on mindful attention, aesthetic sensitivity, and social harmony creates recognizable continuity despite surface modifications required by contemporary circumstances. Modern practitioners use electric kettles instead of charcoal braziers, but they develop the same patience and precision that characterized their historical predecessors. The specific implements change, while the underlying cultivation of human potential continues, according to principles discovered by samurai wives, who probably never imagined their insights would prove relevant to smartphone-wielding urbanites. The educational institutions that preserve and transmit traditional tea ceremony knowledge represent remarkable organizational continuity, spanning multiple centuries of social disruption. The schools established by Meiji period traditionalists evolved into modern institutions that maintain authentic traditional instruction while adapting to contemporary educational needs. These organizations preserve not just technical knowledge, but philosophical frameworks and training methodologies that continue producing practitioners capable of accessing the transformative benefits that originally motivated samurai wives to invest enormous time and resources in ceremony mastery. You realize you're witnessing one of history's most successful cultural preservation achievements. The business applications of tea ceremony principles demonstrate their practical value in contemporary professional environments. Companies send executives to tea ceremony training to develop leadership skills, conflict resolution abilities, and aesthetic judgment that improve performance in ways that conventional business education doesn't address. The emphasis on attention to detail, patient preparation, and creating harmonious atmospheres translates directly into management capabilities. While the practice of finding beauty in constraint provides creative problem-solving approaches valuable in resource-limited situations, these applications prove that samurai wives weren't just preserving cultural ornaments, but developing practical human enhancement techniques with enduring relevance. The global spread of tea ceremony influence creates international communities united by shared appreciation for principles that transcend cultural boundaries. You observe practitioners from vastly different backgrounds, finding common ground through shared aesthetic experiences that mirror the diplomatic achievements of samurai wives, who used ceremony gatherings to bridge political differences. The universal human responses to beauty, ritual, and mindful attention create connections that bypass linguistic and cultural barriers, suggesting that these women discovered fundamental aspects of human nature rather than culturally specific customs. The environmental consciousness embedded in traditional tea ceremony principles anticipates contemporary ecological awareness in ways that seem almost prophetic. The emphasis on seasonal sensitivity, resource conservation, and appreciation for natural beauty provides philosophical frameworks for addressing environmental challenges that didn't exist when these practices developed. Modern practitioners often discover that ceremony training develops environmental awareness and sustainable lifestyle practices naturally, as mindful attention to natural cycles creates emotional connections to ecological systems that purely intellectual environmental education often fails to achieve. The technological adaptations of tea ceremony principles demonstrate their fundamental resilience and continued relevance. Online ceremony instruction maintains essential educational elements while reaching global audiences. Virtual reality applications create immersive traditional environments for urban practitioners, and mobile apps help busy professionals incorporate ceremony principles into daily routines. These technological integrations preserve authentic traditional elements while making them accessible to contemporary lifestyles, proving that core principles remain valuable even when surface forms require dramatic modification. As you watch Tanaka-sensei's students complete their final bows and begin collecting their belongings, you realize you've witnessed something remarkable, the ultimate triumph of those samurai wives who dedicated their lives to cultivating human potential through aesthetic practice. Their teachings survived the collapse of their political system, the transformation of their social structure, and the complete reconstruction of daily life, emerging stronger and more relevant than ever. In our age of digital distraction and global uncertainty, their emphasis on mindful attention, aesthetic sensitivity, and compassionate social interaction, provides exactly the psychological resources modern humans need most desperately. The businesswoman beside you moves with newfound grace as she carefully folds her practice cloth, her earlier anxiety replaced by centered calm that will influence every interaction for the rest of her day. She doesn't know she's benefiting from innovations developed by medieval Japanese women who faced their own versions of stress and uncertainty, but their legacy lives within her transformed awareness. You smile, imagining how proud those samurai wives would feel knowing their dedication to human flourishing continues blessing lives in ways they never could have anticipated. The soft sound of students' footsteps fading into